Thrown out before winter, she built a limestone heater. August Halverson, who had survived 17 Dakota winters and buried a son to the cold, told her plainly, "Keep those babies in that wet hole, and the cold will take them before Sunday." She had $17, 2 children, and no way to cut dry or haul enough fuel before blizzard season. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. But 4 months earlier, Ragna Moen had never burned lime in her life. She had arrived in Yankton County in August of 1887 with a trunk, 2 children, and the memory of a husband's back disappearing down a freight road toward Kansas. The wagon that brought her carried everything she still owned. Liv sat beside her, 8 years old and silent. Nels slept against her ribs, 5 years old and trusting in a way that made Ragna's chest ache. The town near the landing looked like survival, storefronts, a post office, women carrying market baskets. Ragna found a back room behind a laundry house and took in washing for 11 cents a bundle. She filed her homestead claim as a deserted wife, which the law allowed, and she waited for the day she could occupy the land and begin proving it up. That day came in September, but not the way she had planned. Sheriff Amos Kittredge appeared at her door on a Tuesday morning with a paper that claimed she owed $14 in storage fees for a wagon she had never stored. The signature at the bottom belonged to a man named Jonas Creel, who bought distressed claims the way other men bought cattle. "You can settle the debt," Kittredge said. He was a thick man with small eyes and clean boots. "Or you can sign your file-in rights to Mr. Creel and walk away clear." Ragna looked at the paper. She looked at her children eating cold porridge behind her. She looked at the sheriff's clean boots on her mud-tracked floor. "I filed legal," she said. "I owe nothing. The court says different." "Then the court is wrong." Kittredge smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "You have 72 hours to vacate this room and occupy your claim. If you're not on that land by Friday sunset, you forfeit." He left the paper on her table and walked out. Ragna stood in the doorway and watched him go. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the cold understanding that she had just made an enemy of the only law in the county, and that enemy wanted her land. She had 72 hours to move everything she owned to a claim she had never seen, in a place she had never been, with no wagon, no team, and no help. She started packing before the sheriff's wagon reached the end of the street. The claims sat on a shelf cut into the bluff above the Missouri River Trench. Ragna found it by walking because no one would rent her a wagon after Kittredge put the word out. She carried Nels on her back for the last 2 miles. Liv walked beside her without complaint, though her shoes had worn through at the heel. What Ragna found was not a homestead. It was a hole. Someone had started a dugout years before and abandoned it. The back wall was raw earth braced with rotting timber. The side walls were part stone, part clay, part nothing. The front wall was 3 planks nailed to a crooked frame with a door that hung from one leather hinge. The roof was sawed over branches and water dripped through in 6 places. Inside, the space was 12 feet deep and 9 feet wide. The floor was packed dirt gone soft with moisture. The smell was clay and mold and something dead that Ragna never found. There was no stove. There was no chimney. There was no glass in the single window opening, just a board propped against the frame. Ragna set Nels down on the driest patch of ground and looked at what she had. A trunk with clothes, 1 blanket, a Bible, and her mother's sewing kit. A wash kettle and an iron wash boiler, hauled on her back in 2 trips. A broken stove body with no grate, no legs, no pipe. Scrap stovepipe that didn't fit the stove. A shovel with a cracked handle. A hand hammer. 2 flour sacks. Half a quart of driftwood stacked against the bluff by some previous failure. And $17 in coin hidden in the hem of her winter coat. Liv stood in the doorway. Mama, she said, where do we sleep? Ragna looked at the dripping roof, the mud floor, the single rotting bench against the back wall. We sleep here, she said. This is home now. August Halverson came on the third day. Ragna had heard of him from the women at the landing. 17 winters in Dakota Territory, lost a son to the stock storm of 1880 when the boy went out to check cattle and never came back. Buried him in spring when the snow finally melted enough to find the body. Halverson knew cold the way most men knew their own hands. He rode up on a gray mare that looked as weathered as he did. 60 years old, maybe more. Deep lines around his eyes, a beard that had gone white at the edges. He sat in the saddle and looked at the dugout for a long moment before he spoke. You're the Moen woman. I am. You have children in there. I do. Halverson dismounted. He walked to the dugout and put his hand on the door frame. The wood gave slightly under his palm. This frame is rotted through, he said. You push hard on this door and the whole front comes down. I know. You have no chimney. The stove body is broken. I'm working on a solution. Halverson walked around to the side of the dugout. He looked at the woodpile. He counted under his breath. Half a cord, he said. Maybe less. That driftwood is punky, burns fast, throws sparks. You'll get 2 weeks out of it if you're careful. Maybe 3. I know. Winter here runs 4 months minimum, 5 in a bad year. Ragna said nothing. Halverson walked to the back of the dugout and looked up at the bluff. Pale stone showed through the dirt in places. He didn't seem to notice it. You have no team, he said. No wagon. No way to haul timber from up the river where the cottonwood grows decent. You have no money for coal, I asked at the landing. Kittredge has made sure no one will extend you credit. You seem to know a great deal about my situation. I know what I see. Halverson turned to face her. His eyes were not unkind, but they were not soft either. I buried my boy because I let him go out in weather I knew was dangerous. I will not watch another mother bury children because she was too proud to hear the truth. Then tell me the truth. Halverson pointed at the dugout. That is not a home. That is a grave waiting to be filled. You have no shelter that will hold against a real cold snap. You have no fuel to last the winter. You have no way to get fuel. You have 2 children who need you alive, and you are standing in a hole in the ground pretending that determination will keep them warm. Ragna felt her jaw tighten. What would you have me do? Leave. Tonight. Walk back to the landing and find a family that needs kitchen help. Let the children board with the church women until spring. Give up the claim and let Kittredge have it. He'll win anyway. The only question is whether your children are alive when he does. And if I refuse? Halverson stepped closer. His voice dropped. Keep those babies in that wet hole through January, and the cold will take them before Sunday. The words landed like stones. Ragna felt them in her chest, in her throat, in the place where her breath should have been. Halverson mounted his mare. He looked down at her with something that might have been pity, might have been respect, might have been both. I have seen women stronger than you break against this land, he said. I have seen men with full crews and good timber freeze in their beds. You have nothing. You have less than nothing. And winter is coming whether you believe it or not. He rode away without looking back. Ragna stood in the mud beside her dugout and watched him go. Her hands were shaking again. This time it was fear, real fear, the kind that lives in the belly and whispers in the dark. She had $17, she had 2 children, and she had no way to cut, dry, and haul enough fuel to survive a Dakota winter. The math was simple. The math was impossible. She turned and looked at the pale stone showing through the bluff behind her dugout. She had noticed it the first day, chalky, almost white, different from the clay and shale around it. She didn't know why she kept looking at it. She didn't know why it mattered. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory was stirring. White stone, rain, steam rising in cold air. She just couldn't remember where she had seen it before. The memory came back 3 nights later, in the dark, while Nels coughed in his sleep, and Liv shivered under their single blanket. St. Louis. Ragna was 9 years old. Her father was working as a laborer on a warehouse foundation near the river. She had brought him his lunch pail and stayed to watch the men work. There was a pile of white stones near the wall, pale, almost like chalk. A man was breaking them with a hammer and loading them into a cart. Then it started to rain. The rain hit the white stones, and they hissed. Steam rose from the pile. The man stumbled backward, cursing. Ragna watched, fascinated, as the stones cracked and popped and gave off heat she could feel from 10 feet away. "Stay back," her father said. "That's live lime. It'll burn you worse than fire." She never forgot the image. White stones hissing in the rain, steam rising, heat where there was no flame. But she had never understood what she was seeing. Not then. Not in the 17 years since. Now, lying in a wet dugout with children who might not survive the winter, she understood that she needed to find someone who could explain it. She found Elias Torgrim at the landing, living in a lean-to behind the warehouse where she had once taken in washing. He was 62 years old, with hands that shook slightly and eyes that had gone cloudy with cataracts. He walked with a limp from an ankle crushed under a dropped cornerstone 15 years before. He had been a mason once, then a lime burner, then nothing at all. Ragna had asked the women at the wash house who knew about lime. 3 of them pointed to the old man in the lean-to. She found him sitting on a crate, sorting river stones by weight and color. He looked up when she approached, but didn't stand. "You're the one Kittredge pushed out," he said. His accent was Norwegian, like hers. His voice was rough with age and tobacco. "I am. I heard about your claim. Bad piece of ground, wet, exposed, no timber worth the name." "I know what it is." Elias set down the stone he was holding. He looked at her for a long moment, the way Halverson had looked at her, but there was something different in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. "You didn't come here to tell me about your problems," he said. "You came here to ask about something." "I came to ask about lime." Elias went still. "What do you know about lime?" "I know that when I was a girl, I saw white stones hiss and smoke when rain touched them. I know that heat came off those stones with no fire. I know that the bluff behind my dugout is full of pale rock that looks the same. And you want to know if you can use it? I want to know if I can survive with it." Elias stood slowly. He walked past her to the edge of the lean-to and looked out at the river. The water was gray under an October sky. The wind was cold. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Bring a piece of that pale stone from your bluff. I'll tell you if you're going to live or die." Ragna brought the stone the next morning. It was the size of her fist, pale gray-white, with a texture like chalk, and chalk's tendency to crumble at the edges. Elias held it up to the light. He scraped it with his thumbnail. He touched it to his tongue and spat. "Limestone," he said. "Good quality. High calcium. This will burn." "Burn into what?" "Into something you can use." He set the stone on his workbench and looked at her. "Sit down. I'm going to tell you something that most people never learn, and you're going to listen." Ragna sat on an upturned bucket. Elias pulled out a smaller stone from a box behind him, pure white, lighter than the one she had brought. "This is quicklime," he said. "It was limestone once. Then I burned it. Hot fire, 800 degrees or more for hours. The burning drives off part of the stone. What's left is this." He held up the white stone. It looked almost soft, despite being rock. "Quicklime is alive," Elias said. Not like a person, like a fire waiting to happen. It wants water. It needs water. And when it gets water, he took a metal spoon from his bench, filled it with water from a cup, and held it over the white stone. Then he poured. The stone hissed. Steam rose. The spoon grew hot in his hand, hot enough that he shifted his grip. "Feel," he said. Ragna held her hand over the spoon. Heat radiated upward, as if there were coals beneath it. "That's the fire you burned months ago," Elias said. "Stored in the stone, released by water. No spark, no flame, no smoke, just heat." Ragna stared at the steaming stone. Her mind was racing. Could this heat a room? It could warm one for a while. Could it boil water? Easily. Could it? She stopped. She was thinking too fast. Could it keep children alive when there's no wood to burn? Elias set down the spoon. He looked at her for a long time. "It might," he said, "if you had enough, if you kept it dry, if you used it carefully, if you didn't burn yourself or your children or your dugout to ash." He leaned forward. "This is not a toy. This is not a trick. Quicklime will blind you if it gets in your eyes. It will burn your skin like acid. The steam it makes when it slakes can fill a room and choke you. I have seen men scarred for life from carelessness. But it works. It works." Elias stood and walked to the window. "The question is whether you can make it work. You need fuel to burn the lime in the first place. You need containers to store it dry. You need an iron vessel to slake it safely. You need sand or clay to bank the heat. You need discipline and patience and luck." He turned to face her. "You have almost nothing. How do you expect to build what you need before winter?" Ragna thought about her $17, her half-cord of driftwood, her broken stove and her dripping roof, and her 2 children who trusted her to keep them alive. "I don't know," she said, "but I know that cutting wood won't work. I can't cut enough, can't dry enough, can't haul enough. Every path that looks normal ends with my children dead. This path," she pointed at the steaming spoon, "this path might be impossible, but it's the only one that might work." Elias studied her face. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, not doubt. Something else. "You measure before you panic," he said quietly. "That's rare. Will you teach me?" "I'll teach you what I can." He reached under his bench and pulled out a battered tin box. "But I'm old and half blind, and my hands don't work like they used to. You're going to do the work. I'll just show you how not to kill yourself doing it." He opened the tin box. Inside were more white stones, each wrapped in waxed cloth. "Lesson 1, he said. "Storage. This stone will turn to powder the moment it touches damp air. It has to stay dry until you need it. If you can't keep it dry, you have nothing." Ragna leaned forward. "Show me." Martha Vale arrived at Ragna's dugout 4 days later, carrying a basket of autumn squash and a face full of doubt. She was 40 years old, a neighbor of sorts, living 2 miles south on better ground with a husband who could still work and sons who could haul timber. She had survived 12 Dakota winters and buried 2 daughters to fever. She knew what survival cost. "I heard what you're doing," Martha said. She set the basket on the ground but didn't offer it. "Burning cliff rock, storing powder. People are talking. People always talk. They're saying you've lost your mind, that the cold and the debt broke something inside you." Martha looked at the bluff behind the dugout, where Ragna had been breaking loose stone all morning. "They're saying you're cooking rocks instead of cutting wood. Cooking rocks takes less fuel than heating a whole dugout for 5 months. But you still need fuel to cook them. I need fuel once, then I have heat stored for whenever I need it. Wood rots when it gets wet. This stone doesn't care about rain." Martha shook her head. "If you have wood enough to burn rocks, then cut wood instead." That's what anyone sensible would do. Ragna set down her hammer. Her hands were scraped raw from the stone. Her back ached from lifting. She was exhausted and hungry and running out of time. You're right, she said. Anyone sensible would do that. Anyone sensible would also have a husband who didn't disappear, a team to haul timber, money for coal, time to prepare. She picked up the hammer again. I have none of those things. I have a wet hole and 2 children and a piece of knowledge that everyone thinks is worthless. Knowledge doesn't burn. No, it doesn't. Ragna swung the hammer and cracked loose another chunk of limestone. But it can be stored in rock and released when you need it. Show me how to store wood for 6 months without rot. Show me how to cut and haul enough for 5 months when I have no wagon and no team, and 3 weeks before the cold comes. Show me any other way and I'll take it. Martha was silent for a moment. Then she picked up the basket of squash and held it out. My husband says you're a fool, she said. I think he might be right, but I also think you might be the most stubborn woman I've ever met, and I've met some stubborn women. Ragna took the basket. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. If this works, you can thank me. If it doesn't, Martha looked at the children playing in the dugout doorway. If it doesn't, I'll be the one digging your graves. She walked away without looking back. Ragna looked at the squash in her hands. Then she looked at the pile of limestone growing beside the bluff. She had a plan that might be madness. She had a teacher who might be too old to help. She had a community that thought she was insane. And she had less than 3 weeks before the first real cold would come. Sheriff Amos Kittredge came the next week. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 men Ragna didn't recognize, hired hands probably, from Jonas Creel's operation. They sat in a wagon at the edge of her claim and watched while Kittredge walked up to the dugout. Ragna was stacking dried limestone in the shade of the bluff. She had washed each piece and set them in the sun to dry before the night damp could reach them. It was slow work, careful work, and Kittredge walked right through the middle of her drying racks. Careful, she said. That stone needs to stay clean. Kittredge looked down at his boots, now dusty with limestone powder. He smiled. Still playing with rocks, he said. I'd heard, but I didn't believe it. What do you want? I want to make sure you understand your situation. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. This is a notice of concern regarding unsafe materials stored in proximity to minor children. Quicklime, or whatever you're calling it. Quicklime is a known caustic substance. The county has a duty to protect children from harm. If a complaint is filed, I'd be obligated to investigate, possibly remove the children for their safety. Ragna felt her hands curl into fists. You would take my children because I'm storing lime. I would protect innocent children from a mother who has clearly become unwell. Kittredge stepped closer. His voice dropped. You could end this today. Sign the claim over to Creel. I'll personally ensure your family finds safe lodging for the winter. Your children will be warm, fed, healthy. My children will stay with me. In a dirt hole, burning rocks for heat? Kittredge laughed. It was an ugly sound. Woman, I've done you a kindness by giving you time. Most squatters don't get a second chance, but my patience has limits. Then reach them, Ragna said. File your complaint. Take me to court. Explain to the judge how a mother who's trying to keep her children warm is a danger to them, while a sheriff who drove her from her home with false debts is their protector. Kittredge's smile faded. His eyes went flat. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Ragna picked up her hammer. A man who wants my land and thinks a widow with children is easy prey. A man who's never burned lime, never built a kiln, never done anything harder than push papers and collect bribes. She raised the hammer. This conversation is over. Get off my claim. Kittredge stood very still for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to the wagon. Winter's coming, Mrs. Moen, he called over his shoulder. I'll be checking on you, making sure those children are safe. The wagon pulled away in a cloud of dust. Ragna watched until it disappeared over the rise. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were shaking. She had just made her enemy angrier. She had just given him a reason to watch her more closely. She had just guaranteed that if she failed, he would take everything she had left. But she couldn't have done anything else, couldn't have backed down, couldn't have surrendered. She picked up another stone and set it on the drying rack. She had 2 weeks left, maybe less. The first kiln burn happened on the 23rd of October. Elias came to the claim the night before, walking the 2 miles from the landing on his bad ankle because no one would lend him a horse. He brought a canvas bag of tools and a smaller bag of something Ragna didn't recognize. Coal screenings, he said. Bought them with my last 4 bits. They'll burn hotter than driftwood at the core. You didn't have to do that. I know. He looked at the pile of limestone she had accumulated. You've been busy. I've been desperate. They worked through the night by lantern light, building the kiln. It wasn't a real kiln, not the kind Elias had used in his working years. It was a pit lined with clay, surrounded by a ring of larger stones, filled with alternating layers of limestone and fuel. Driftwood at the base, coal screenings in the center, corn twists, dried corn cobs twisted into bundles, packed around the sides, more driftwood on top. The fire has to be hot enough and long enough, Elias said. 800 degrees, maybe more. Hold it for 4 hours at least. 6 is better. How will I know when it's done? The stones will ring different, lighter, hollow, like a bell instead of a thud. He picked up a raw limestone chunk and tapped it against another, a dull clunk. That's before. He picked up a small piece of quicklime from his bag and tapped it, a higher sound, almost musical. That's after. When your stones sound like this, you're done. They lit the kiln at dawn. The fire caught slowly at first, smoking and sputtering through the damp morning air. Ragna fed it carefully, adding fuel when the flames dropped, banking the edges with more clay when the heat tried to escape. By noon, the kiln was roaring. Heat shimmered above it. The limestone at the center glowed dull red through gaps in the fuel. Liv and Nels watched from the dugout doorway. Ragna had forbidden them from coming closer. Mama's cooking rocks, Nels said. Mama's making something important, Liv corrected. Be quiet and watch. Ragna fed the kiln through the afternoon. Her face was burned from the heat. Her hands were blistered from handling hot fuel. She hadn't eaten since dawn. Elias sat nearby, watching. He couldn't work the kiln himself. His eyes couldn't judge the fire color, and his hands couldn't grip the tools. But he could teach. Too much air on the left side, he said. Bank it with clay. You're losing heat. She banked it. The center is getting too hot. Pull some fuel from the top. She pulled. Now add it to the edges. Even the burn, she added. By sunset, she was shaking with exhaustion, but the kiln was still burning. The stones at the center had shifted from red to white. The sound when she tapped them with a long stick had changed. Try one, Elias said. Ragna used tongs to pull a stone from the edge of the kiln. She dropped it in a bucket of water. The hiss was immediate. Steam exploded upward. The stone cracked and popped and threw off heat that made her step back. Good, Elias said. That one's alive. Ragna looked at the kiln. Dozens of stones slowly turning from raw rock to stored heat. How many do I need? More than this. This is your first batch. You'll need 3 more, maybe 4. and you'll need to store them perfectly dry. Ragna looked at the sky. Clouds were building to the west. The air smelled like rain. The weather's turning. I know. Elias pushed himself to his feet. You have maybe 2 weeks of burning weather left. After that, the fuel will be too wet to light. 2 weeks, 4 batches, and her fuel supply was already half gone. The first setback came 3 days later. Ragna had built the second kiln closer to the bluff, trying to shield it from the wind that had been stealing heat from the first burn. She had scavenged more fuel, broken fence rails bought for 30 cents from a farmer who thought she was insane, dried corn twists traded for a day's worth of washing, coal screening she had walked 8 miles to buy. The kiln was loaded, the fire was lit, the stones were starting to glow. Then the rain came. It started as a drizzle, the kind that the first kiln had survived. But within an hour, it had become a downpour. Water ran down the bluff in streams. The clay banking around the kiln turned to mud. The fire guttered and smoked. Ragna tried to cover it with canvas, but the canvas wasn't big enough. She tried to build a shelter overhead with boards, but the boards were too few and the rain was too heavy. By midnight, the kiln was cold. She stood in the rain beside it, looking at the half-burned stones. Some of them might be usable. Most of them were ruined, too calcined to be raw limestone, not calcined enough to be quicklime. Useless. She had lost a third of her remaining fuel. She had lost 3 days of drying time. She had lost a batch of stones that she couldn't replace, and the rain was still falling. Elias found her the next morning, sitting in the dugout doorway, staring at the ruined kiln. "Bad burn," he said. "Bad everything." "You still have fuel?" "Some. Enough for maybe one more full batch, 2 small ones." "Then burn 1 more full batch." He sat down beside her on the wet ground. His joints creaked. "You don't need 4 batches, you need enough. Enough to get through the worst nights. Enough to boil water and warm stones and keep the cold from killing. You won't heat the whole dugout with lime. You'll survive with it. And if 1 more batch isn't enough, then you pray for a mild winter." He looked at her. "But you were going to pray for that anyway." Ragna almost laughed. "Almost. The fuel is getting wet," she said. "Even the stuff under cover. The air's too damp." "Then burn today, while you still can." "The rain. The rain will stop by noon. I can feel it." He tapped his bad knee. "My joints know weather better than any almanac. You have 6 hours of dry air coming. Use them." Ragna looked at the sky. Still gray. Still dripping. But Elias was already standing, already walking toward the fuel pile. "Come on," he said. "We have a kiln to build." The third kiln burned through the afternoon of October 29th. It was smaller than the first 2. Ragna didn't have fuel for a full batch, but she packed what she had as tight as she could, layered it as carefully as Elias had taught her, and lit it the moment the rain stopped. The fire burned hot and fast, hotter than the first batch. The dry fuel and the desperate stoking pushed the temperature higher than before. By sunset, she was pulling stones from the kiln that rang like bells when she tapped them. She stored them in every container she could find. Tin cans with lids hammered tight, crocks sealed with wax, flour sacks double-wrapped and tied with twine. She stacked them in the driest corner of the dugout, on a shelf she had built above the waterline, away from the dripping roof. 6 good containers, maybe 40 pounds of quicklime. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough, but it was something, and something was more than she had started with. That night, Nels's cough got worse. He had been coughing since the rain started, a wet, rattling sound that made Ragna's heart clench every time she heard it. She had given him warm water with honey when she could get honey. She had wrapped him in the blanket and held him close. But the cough was getting deeper. His forehead was hot. Ragna sat beside him in the darkness of the dugout, listening to him breathe. Each breath sounded like a struggle. "Mama?" Liv's voice came from across the room. "Is Nels going to be all right?" Ragna wanted to say yes, wanted to promise that everything would be fine, but she had made too many promises already. "I don't know," she said, "but I'm going to do everything I can." She reached for the matches and the pile of damp brush beside the broken stove. If she could get a fire going, just a small one, just enough to warm the air, the brush was too wet. It smoked and sputtered and died. Ragna looked at the shelf where her quicklime was stored. She had planned to save it for the worst of winter, for the true emergencies. But wasn't this an emergency? Her son was sick. The air was cold. The fire wouldn't light. She climbed up to the shelf and took down one of the smaller tins. Inside, the white chunks were perfectly dry, perfectly sealed. "Elias told me how to do this," she whispered to herself. "Slow and careful, not too much water." She set the iron wash boiler on the floor, surrounded by a ring of sand and clay she had prepared for exactly this moment. She placed 2 chunks of quicklime inside. Then she added water. Just a cup. Just enough. The hiss was immediate. Steam rose. The metal began to warm. Ragna held her hand above the boiler. Heat. Real heat rising from stone and water. She filled her wash kettle and set it on top of the boiler. Within minutes, the water was steaming. She poured it into a bowl and held it under Nels's face, letting him breathe the warm, moist air. His coughing eased. Just a little. Just enough. Ragna sat back and looked at the steaming boiler. Her heart was pounding. It worked. It actually worked. But Halvorsson's words still echoed in her mind. An hour of warmth is not a winter. A sick child breathing easier is not a season survived. She had maybe 40 pounds of quicklime. Each slake used 2 or 3 pounds. That was 15 emergency heats, maybe 20 if she was careful. And winter hadn't even started yet. Outside, the wind was picking up. The air smelled like snow. Ragna looked at her children, looked at her tiny store of impossible heat, looked at the door that barely hung on its hinges, the roof that still dripped, the walls that let in the cold. She had done everything she could think of. She had learned things most people never knew. She had built something from nothing but desperation and white stone, and she still didn't know if it would be enough. The question hung in the darkness like smoke. Could she survive a Dakota winter with 40 pounds of quicklime, 2 children, and a dugout that everyone said would be her grave? She wouldn't know the answer until the cold came to test it. November came with teeth. The first snow fell on the 3rd of the month, a light dusting that melted by noon, but left frost on the inside of the dugout window board. Ragna woke to find ice crystals on Nels's blanket, forming where his breath had condensed in the night. She had 12 days of good weather left, maybe fewer. Elias had been right about the burning window closing. The fuel that wasn't already under cover was too damp to light. The driftwood she had stacked against the bluff had turned gray with moisture. But she wasn't done yet. The morning after the first snow, she walked to the landing and spent 3 of her remaining dollars on coal slack, the dust and fragments left over after the good coal was sold. It burned dirty and fast, but it burned hot. She hauled it back in flour sacks, 40 pounds at a time, until her shoulders ached and her hands bled. The 4th kiln burned on November 5th. This time, she built a shelter first. Scrap boards propped against the bluff, covered with canvas she had traded her mother's sewing kit to get. The shelter wasn't much. Wind still got through, and rain dripped at the edges, but it kept the worst of the weather off the kiln. The burn took 8 hours. Ragna fed it through the day, watching the stones change color, listening for the ring that meant they were ready. Elias sat nearby, wrapped in a blanket she had given him, calling out adjustments she could barely hear over the roar of the fire. By sunset, she had another 30 pounds of quicklime, 70 pounds total, maybe 80 if she counted the pieces that might be good enough. It still wasn't enough. But it was closer. Elias stayed that night. He couldn't walk back to the landing in the dark, not with his ankle in his eyes, and Ragna wouldn't let him try. They sat in the dugout after the children were asleep, sharing a meal of cornmeal mush and the last of Martha's squash. The fire in the broken stove had finally caught. Ragna had dried enough brush over the past week to get a small flame going, but it threw more smoke than heat. "You're pushing too hard," Elias said. "I can see it in your face. You're not eating enough, not sleeping enough." "I'll eat when I'm done. I'll sleep when winter's over." "You'll die before winter's over if you keep this pace." Ragna looked at the shelf where her quicklime was stored. The tins and crocks and sealed sacks lined up like soldiers waiting for battle. "How much did you make in your working years?" she asked. "When you were burning lime for the warehouses?" "Tons. Literal tons." Elias's voice was soft with memory. "We had proper kilns, crews of men, fuel by the wagon load. We burned for weeks at a time, filled carts with quickite for mortar and whitewash and plaster." He shook his head. "What you're doing, this is nothing like that. This is survival work, desperation work." "Did you ever use it for heat?" "Once." He stared into the smoking fire. "The winter of '62. I was working a job in Illinois, and the foreman's wife went into labor 3 weeks early. Middle of January, 20 below, and the stove went out because the wood was wet. We had quicklime ready for a job the next day." He paused. "I slaked a batch in a wash tub, boiled water for the birth, kept the room warm enough that the baby didn't freeze in its first hour of life." "Did the baby live?" "She did. Named her Charlotte. She'd be 25 now, if she's still alive." Ragna was quiet for a moment. "Why did you stop burning lime?" "My ankle." Elias lifted his bad foot, rotated it slowly. "A cornerstone slipped off a cart, crushed it flat. I couldn't stand for the long burns anymore, couldn't lift the heavy loads. A lime burner who can't stand is no lime burner at all." "But you still remember everything." "Memory doesn't fade like muscle." He tapped his temple. "I've got 30 years of lime burning up here, every technique, every trick, every mistake I ever made or saw someone else make. It's all still there. I just can't use it anymore." "You're using it now." Elias looked at her. In the dim light of the smoking fire, his clouded eyes seemed to clear for a moment. "I suppose I am," he said. "Though I never thought I'd be teaching a Norwegian widow to survive a Dakota winter with nothing but riverstone and stubbornness." "Is that what I am? Stubborn?" "You're worse than stubborn. You're convinced." He almost smiled. "Stubborn is a mule that won't move. Convinced is a woman who sees something no one else can see and won't stop until she proves it's real." Ragna thought about that, about the white stones hissing in the rain 20 years ago, about the steam rising from Elias's spoon, about the heat in her hands when she had held them over the wash boiler, feeling something impossible become real. "My father used to say something," she said, "when I was a girl. He'd say, 'Ragna, the world is full of people who know what can't be done. Be the one who does it anyway.'" Smart man. He died in a factory accident when I was 12, knew everything about what could be done and nothing about staying alive to do it. She pulled her blanket tighter. "I used to be angry at him for that, for leaving us. Now I think I understand. He wasn't careless. He was convinced. He saw something that needed doing, and he did it, even when it cost him everything. And you think you're the same." I think I don't have a choice. Ragna looked at her children sleeping in the corner. Nels's breathing had eased after the steaming water, but the cough was still there, lurking. I can be careful and watch them die. Or I can be convinced and maybe watch them live. Elias was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. I was saving this, he said, for an emergency, but I think you need it more than I do. He opened the pouch and poured the contents into his palm. Coins, silver coins, worn and old. $11, he said. Everything I have left in the world. I can't take that. You're not taking it. I'm giving it. He pressed the coins into her hand. Buy more fuel. Buy better containers. Buy whatever you need to get through the next burn. And when spring comes, he closed her fingers around the money. When spring comes, you'll pay me back by being alive. Ragna looked at the coins, looked at the old man with clouded eyes and a crushed ankle who had walked 2 miles in the cold to help a woman he barely knew. Why? She asked. Why are you doing this? Because I'm old and I'm tired and I've spent the last 15 years watching myself become useless. His voice cracked slightly. And then you walked into my lean-to asking about lime, and suddenly I wasn't useless anymore. Suddenly all those years of knowledge meant something again. He pulled his hand back. You're not the only one who needs this to work, Mrs. Moen. You're not the only one with something to prove. Ragna felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back. Thank you, she said. I don't know how to. Don't thank me. Survive. That's all the thanks I need. The 5th kiln burned on November 9th. Ragna used Elias's money to buy every scrap of dry fuel she could find. Barrel staves, broken crates, a pile of corn cobs a farmer's wife had been saving for kindling. She paid twice what they were worth because Kittredge had spread the word, and she paid without complaint because she had no choice. This burn was different. She had learned from the failures. She built the kiln tighter, with better clay banking. She layered the fuel more carefully, creating channels for airflow that Elias had described from his years of professional work. She watched the fire like a hawk watches prey, adjusting and feeding and banking until her hands were black with soot, and her face was raw from the heat. The burn lasted 10 hours. By the end, she was swaying on her feet, half blind from smoke and exhaustion. But when she pulled the first stone from the kiln and dropped it in water, the hiss was louder than any she had heard before. The steam rose in a thick column. The heat was fierce and immediate. Good lime, Elias said. He had been watching from his spot by the bluff, too weak to help, but too stubborn to leave. That's the best batch you've made. Ragna pulled more stones, tested them one by one. Most of them rang true, 40 more pounds, maybe 45. She stored them with the others. The shelf in the dugout was getting crowded now. Tins and crocks and sealed sacks, stacked 2 deep. 120 pounds of quicklime, give or take. She did the math in her head. 3 pounds per slake. 40 slakes, maybe 50 if she was careful. Each slake gave her an hour of strong heat, maybe 2 hours of fading warmth, 50 hours of emergency heat to get through 5 months of winter. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. But the fuel was gone. The burning weather was over. The first real cold was coming, and there was nothing left to do but wait. Halverson came back on November 15th. He rode up on the same gray mare, wearing the same weathered coat. But something in his face had changed. The certainty was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Curiosity, maybe, or doubt. He dismounted and walked to the dugout without speaking. He looked at the shelter Ragna had built over the kiln site. He looked at the stacks of empty fuel containers. He looked at the shelf visible through the dugout door, crowded with sealed tins. I heard you've been busy, he said. I have. burning cliff rock, storing powder. He picked up a small piece of limestone that had fallen during transport, turned it over in his hands. People are saying you have lost your mind for certain now, that the debt and the cold have broken you. What do you say? Halverson was quiet for a moment. Then he walked to the dugout and put his hand on the door frame just as he had the first time he visited. I say the frame is still rotted. The roof still leaks. The walls still let in the cold. He turned to face her. But I also say I've never seen anyone prepare for winter the way you have. I don't understand what you're doing. I don't think it will work. But I admit, he paused, as if the words cost him something. I admit I'm not certain anymore. Not certain of what? Not certain you'll die. It was the closest thing to hope Ragna had heard from anyone in weeks. You told me the cold would take my children before Sunday, she said. Do you still believe that? Halverson looked at the shelf of quicklime, looked at the children playing by the bluff, healthier than they had been when he first visited, looked at the dugout that was still a hole in the ground, but was also somehow something more. I believe winter will test you, he said. I believe the cold that comes in January will be worse than anything you've prepared for. I believe you're still in danger. He mounted his mare. But I also believe you might surprise me, and I've lived long enough to know that surprises are sometimes good. He rode away without looking back. Ragna watched him go. Her heart was lighter than it had been in weeks, not because he had promised her survival, he hadn't, but because he had admitted doubt. Because even August Halverson, who had buried a son to the cold, who had survived 17 Dakota winters, who knew better than anyone what this land could do, even he wasn't certain anymore. And in uncertainty, there was room for hope. December crawled past like a wounded animal. The cold came in waves, 3 days of bitter wind, then 2 days of false warmth, a week of steady snow, then a morning so clear the sun seemed like a lie. Ragna used her quicklime sparingly. A small slake when Nels's cough returned. A careful heating of wash water when the bucket froze solid overnight. An emergency warm-up when the wind found a gap in the wall and the temperature inside dropped to match the temperature outside. Each use taught her something new. She learned that smaller charges lasted longer than big ones, that warming stones and wrapping them in cloth gave steadier heat than trying to warm the whole room, that the steam was a danger but also a benefit. Moist air eased the children's breathing in the dry winter cold. She learned the rhythm of slaking, water on stone, wait for the hiss, feel the heat rise, remove the warmed kettle, bank the reaction with sand before it got too hot. It was a dance, delicate and dangerous, and she got better at it with each performance. Elias came when he could. Less often, as December wore on, the cold was hard on his bones, and the walk from the landing got longer in his mind, even though the distance stayed the same. But when he came, he taught. The first rule of quicklime, he said one afternoon, watching her prepare a slake, is respect. This isn't wood. It doesn't forgive mistakes. You splash water wrong, you get burned. You breathe the dust, you get sick. You put too much in the trough, you can crack the iron from the heat. I know. You know it here. He tapped her forehead. But do you know it here? He tapped her hands. Your body has to remember what your mind knows, has to react without thinking. Because when the real emergency comes, there won't be time to think. What do I do? Practice. Every day. Even when you don't need the heat. Do a small slake just to keep your hands smart. He watched her pour water, nodded at the result. Good. Again. Smaller charge this time. See how long you can make a handful last. She practiced. Every day. Even when the cold wasn't bad enough to need it. She got faster, smoother, more precise. By Christmas, she could do a slake in the dark. Martha Vale came on the 27th of December. She didn't bring a basket this time. She brought her youngest daughter, a girl of 6 named Sophie, wrapped in blankets and burning with fever. "The doctor won't come," Martha said. Her voice was ragged with exhaustion and fear. "He says it's too far and the cold's too bad and she'll either live or she won't. My husband is in Yankton for supplies and won't be back for 3 days. I didn't know where else to go." Ragna looked at the little girl, small and pale and shivering despite the fever heat. "Bring her in." She set up the wash boiler while Martha held Sophie. A careful slake, not too much lime, not too much water. The heat rose steady and strong. She filled the wash kettle and set it to steam, creating a cloud of warm, moist air in the corner of the dugout. Hold her here," Ragna said. "Let her breathe the steam. It will ease her chest." "What is this?" Martha was staring at the boiler, at the steam, at the heat coming from stone and water. "How is this possible?" "It's lime, quicklime. When you add water, it gives off heat." "Heat from rocks?" "Heat from preparation. I burned these stones months ago. The fire I used then is what's warming your daughter now." Martha's face shifted through confusion, disbelief, and finally something like wonder. "August Halverson said you were storing heat in stone," she whispered. "I thought he was speaking in riddles." He was speaking the truth. The only riddle is why no one else thought to do it. Sophie's breathing eased as the steam did its work. Ragna kept the slate going for an hour, then 2. She warmed stones and wrapped them in cloth, tucked them around the little girl's body. She boiled water for broth that Martha spooned into Sophie's mouth. By morning, the fever had broken. Martha sat in the corner of the dugout, holding her sleeping daughter, staring at Ragna with eyes that had changed. "I called you a fool," she said. "I said my husband would be digging your graves." "You said what everyone was thinking." "I was wrong." Martha's voice cracked. "I was wrong, and you." She looked at the boiler, at the shelf of stored quicklime, at the whole impossible system Ragna had built. "You saved my daughter with rocks and water." "I saved your daughter with knowledge. The rocks were just where I put it." Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, still holding Sophie, and walked to the door. "I'll tell people," she said. "I'll tell everyone what you did, what you built, how it works." "That might make things worse. Kittredge is looking for reasons to say I'm dangerous. Kittredge can hang." Martha's voice was sharp and sudden. "My daughter is alive because of you. I don't care what that man thinks or says or does. I'm going to tell everyone who will listen that Ragna Moen knows something the rest of us don't. And when the real cold comes..." She looked back at the dugout, at the shelf of hope stacked against the wall. "When the real cold comes, I'm going to send every desperate mother I know to your door." She walked out into the gray December morning, Sophie wrapped tight against her chest. Ragna watched her go. Something had shifted. She could feel it in the air, in the quality of the silence that followed Martha's departure. The method had been proven twice now. Nels's cough, Sophie's fever, 2 children saved by heat that came from stone instead of flame. But saving children from sickness was not the same as surviving a blizzard. And the real test, the test that would prove whether this impossible idea could actually work, was still coming. January arrived like a held breath. The first week was cold, but not deadly. 10 below at night, warming to 10 above during the day. The kind of cold that Dakota settlers had learned to endure through thick walls and steady fires, and the simple stubbornness of people who refused to die. Ragna kept her routines, small slakes for practice, careful storage checks to make sure no moisture had crept into her supply, repairs to the dugout where she could manage them, another layer of sod on the roof, more clay packed into the wall gaps, A second board nailed over the window opening. Elias came on the 8th of January. He looked thinner than before, older. The walk from the landing was getting harder. "I can't come much longer," he said. They were sitting in the dugout, sharing a meal of dried beef and hard bread. "My ankle won't carry me through deep snow. My eyes can't find the path when the light gets flat." "Then stay here." "I can't impose." "You're not imposing, you're teaching." Ragna set down her bread. "I need you here when the bad weather hits, not just for the knowledge, but for the hands. I can't watch the children and manage the slakes and keep the whole system running by myself. Not if things get as bad as Halverson says they will." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, until the worst passes. Then I go back to my lean-to and leave you in peace." "Thank you." He stayed. He took the warmest corner of the dugout, the one farthest from the door. He taught the children simple tasks, how to check seal tightness on the storage containers, how to measure water in the same cup every time, how to stay back when the steam started rising. The days passed. The temperature dropped, rose, dropped again. And then January 12th dawned warm. Ragna woke to the sound of dripping. Water was running off the roof, trickling through the gaps in the sod. The air inside the dugout felt almost mild. When she pushed open the door, the sun was shining and the sky was pale blue, and the temperature felt like it might be 30 degrees or more. "Thaw," Elias said. He had woken before her and was standing at the door staring at the sky. "January thaw happens sometimes. Is that bad?" "It's good for the spirit, bad for everything else." He pointed at the mud forming in the yard, at the ice melting off the bluff face. "All that wet is going to freeze again when the temperature drops. And when it drops," he shook his head, "I've seen January thaws before. The cold that follows is always worse than the cold before." Ragna looked at the sky, clear and blue and gentle. "How long do we have?" "Hours, maybe until nightfall, maybe less." Elias turned to face her. "Do everything you were going to do today. Get water from the river before it freezes solid. Get fuel inside if you have any left. Check every seal, every container, every stone. Because when the cold comes back," he paused, "when the cold comes back, it's going to come fast." Ragna spent the morning preparing. She hauled water in every container she had, buckets, pots, the wash boiler emptied and cleaned. She stacked it inside the dugout, against the warmest wall, hoping it wouldn't freeze solid before she could use it. She checked every tin, every crock, every sealed sack of quicklime, found 2 that had moisture seeping in, pulled them down, and used them for a practice slake that she didn't need but couldn't waste. She reinforced the door with boards, stuffed rags into every gap she could find in the walls, piled sod on the roof until it groaned under the weight. Liv helped without being asked. Nels tried to help and mostly got in the way. Elias directed from his corner, too weak to work but too valuable to ignore. By noon, the sky had changed. The blue was gone. In its place, a wall of gray moving in from the northwest, the kind of gray that swallowed the horizon and kept coming. "It's here," Elias said quietly. "God help us. It's here." The wind hit first. It came from the northwest like a living thing, howling across the plains with nothing to stop it. The temperature dropped so fast that Ragna could feel it happening, could feel the air turn from mild to cold to bitter in the space of minutes. She had the children inside. She had the door barred. She had the quicklime ready on the shelf. But she had also made a mistake. The brush pile. The small stack of damp brush and corn twists she had been saving for the stove. She had left it outside that morning, hoping the thaw would dry it enough to burn. Now it was buried under snow that was already packing solid in the wind. "I need to get the fuel," she said. "You can't go out in that," Elias said. The wind was screaming past the door, so loud they had to shout to be heard. "You'll freeze before you reach the pile." "If I don't get it, we have nothing for the stove, nothing for cooking, nothing for—" "We have the lime. The lime is for emergencies. Look outside." Elias pointed at the door, which was shaking in its frame. "This is the emergency. This is what we prepared for. Forget the brush. It's already frozen solid anyway. Use what you have." Ragna looked at the door, looked at the shelf, looked at her children, huddled in the corner with wide eyes. Nels coughed. Just once, but it was enough. "All right," she said. "We start with the lime." The first slake was careful, controlled. A handful of quicklime in the trough, a measured cup of water, the hiss and steam and rising heat. Ragna used it to boil water for drinking, filled the wash kettle and set it over the heat, watched it come to a rolling boil in minutes. She poured the hot water into cups, added dried herbs she had been saving, gave one to each child. "Drink slow," she said. "It has to last." The second slake came an hour later. The temperature inside the dugout was dropping despite the sealed door and the packed walls. Frost was forming on the inside of the window boards. This slake was bigger. More lime, more water. The trough got hot enough that Ragna could feel the heat from 3 feet away. She warmed stones. Flat river rocks she had collected in the fall, scrubbed clean and stored dry. She set them on the trough until they were almost too hot to touch, then wrapped them in cloth and tucked them into the children's bedding. "Keep your hands on the stones," she said. "When they get cool, tell me. I'll warm them again." The wind outside got louder. The walls creaked. Snow was piling against the door. Ragna could see it accumulating through the gaps in the boards. "How long will this last?" Liv asked. Her voice was small but steady. 8 years old and already learning to keep her fear inside. "I don't know," Ragna said. "Hours, maybe days." "Days? We'll be all right. We have what we need." She hoped it was true. By nightfall, the temperature outside had dropped past 20 below. By midnight, it was 30 below and still falling. The dugout held better than Ragna had expected. The packed earth walls, the heavy sod roof, the layers of boards and cloth and clay she had added, they all did their job. The cold crept in, but it crept slowly. The quicklime did the rest. Every 2 hours, Ragna did a slake, small charges, carefully measured. Enough heat to boil water, warm stones, keep the air inside the dugout from reaching the point where breath turned to ice. Elias watched her work. He couldn't help. His hand shook too much. His eyes couldn't see the measurements, but he could advise. "Smaller charge," he said after the third slake. "You're using too much. At this rate, you'll run out before the storm ends." "I'm trying to keep them warm. Warm enough to live, not warm enough to be comfortable." He pulled his blanket tighter. "Save the big charges for when it gets worse." "Worse? This is still early. The real cold comes tomorrow." Ragna looked at her shelf of quicklime. She had started the storm with maybe 110 pounds. She had used 15 pounds already. 4 slakes, 15 pounds, 12 hours. If the storm lasted 3 days, she did the math. She didn't like the answer. "I need to stretch it further," she said. "Then stretch it. Smaller charges, longer gaps. Wrap the stones better so they hold heat longer. Seal the trough between slakes so the residue doesn't absorb moisture from the air." Elias leaned forward. "This is what I taught you. This is what all those practice runs were for. You know how to do this. Trust yourself." Ragna nodded. She looked at her children, curled together under blankets with warm stones at their feet. Trust yourself. She would have to. Dawn came gray and howling. The temperature had fallen past 40 below. Ragna could feel it in the walls, in the floor, in the air that burned when she breathed too deep. The water in the buckets was frozen solid, despite being inside the dugout. The only liquid left was what she could melt with quicklime. She did a slake at first light, a careful one, just enough to boil water and warm the stones again. The children hadn't slept much. The cold kept waking them, but they were alive. Their cheeks had color. Their hands were warm inside their mittens. That was when she heard the sound, a knocking, faint at first, almost lost in the wind, then louder. Someone was at the door. Ragna looked at Elias. His face was pale. "Don't open it," he said. "Someone's out there." "In this?" He gestured at the shaking walls, the screaming wind. "If someone's out there, they're already dead. And if you open that door, you'll kill us too." The knocking came again, harder, more desperate. Ragna went to the door. Through the gaps in the boards, she could see a shape, dark against the white, moving. "Help!" A voice, barely audible, a man's voice. "Please, help." She pulled the bar. "Ragna," Elias started. She opened the door. The man fell inside. He was covered in snow, his clothes frozen stiff, his face the gray-white color of frostbite. She couldn't recognize him at first. The cold had changed his features, twisted them into a mask of suffering. Then she saw the badge on his coat. Sheriff Amos Kittredge. He had been coming to check on her. That's what he said later, when the warmth had brought him back to something like consciousness, coming to make sure her children were safe. Ragna didn't believe him. She thought he had been coming to watch her fail, to witness the death he had predicted, to claim her land when the spring thaw revealed her body. But it didn't matter what he had come for. What mattered was what he had found. His horse had died 2 miles back. The cold had dropped faster than he expected, and the horse had collapsed under him. He had walked the rest of the way through snow that was already drifting to his waist, through wind that cut like knives, through cold that froze the moisture in his lungs. He should have been dead. By any reasonable measure, he should have frozen solid a 1/4 mile from her door. But he had made it, barely, and now he was lying on her floor, shaking with cold that went deeper than muscle, deeper than bone. "We have to warm him," Ragna said. "He tried to destroy you," Elias said. His voice was flat. "He tried to take your children, your land, your life. Let the cold finish what he started." Ragna looked at Kittredge, at the man who had forged debts and threatened her family and made her life a misery since the day she had arrived in Yankton County. Then she looked at her children, at Liv watching with wide eyes, at Nels not understanding what was happening but knowing something was wrong. "No," she said. "We don't do that." She pulled Kittredge closer to the trough. She did a slake, a big one, bigger than she had done all night. The heat rose fierce and fast. She stripped his frozen coat and replaced it with blankets, wrapped warm stones around his body, forced hot water between his blue lips. For an hour she worked. Then 2. The storm raged outside. The cold crept in, and she spent her precious quicklime trying to save a man who had wanted her dead. By noon, Kittredge's color had returned. His shaking had stopped. His eyes opened, focused, and found her face. "You," he said. His voice was a whisper. "You saved me." "I saved a man who was dying. That's all. After everything He stopped. His eyes went to the trough, to the steam rising, to the shelf of sealed containers against the wall. "What is this? How are you doing this?" "Heat from stone. The same thing you called poison. The same thing you wanted to use against me." Kittredge stared at the trough for a long moment. Then he looked at the children, warm and alive in their corner, at Elias, watching with disgust and something like respect, at the walls that were holding, the roof that was staying, the whole impossible system that was keeping everyone alive while the worst cold in years tried to kill them. "I was wrong," he said. "Yes, I was." He tried to sit up, failed, fell back. "I was wrong about everything, about you, about this, about what it takes to survive." "You were wrong about a lot of things." Ragna turned back to the trough, started banking the heat with sand. "But you're alive, and when this is over, you're going to remember that. You're going to remember who saved you and how." She didn't say the rest. Didn't say that she expected him to leave her alone now, to drop his schemes and his threats and his alliance with Jonas Creel. Didn't say that she expected anything at all. She just saved his life and went back to saving her family's. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that never stopped. 3 days of cold that never rose above 30 below. 3 days of careful slakes and warmed stones and melted water and the constant, exhausting work of staying alive. Ragna lost track of the hours, lost track of the days. There was only the rhythm of survival. Check the seals, measure the lime, add the water, feel the heat, warm the stones, wrap the children, start again. By the end, she had used almost 80 pounds of quicklime. She had maybe 30 pounds left. But they were alive. All of them. Even Kittredge, who spent the last 2 days of the storm sitting in the corner, watching Ragna work, saying nothing. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died. Ragna opened the door slowly, not sure what she would find. The snow had drifted over the entrance, formed a wall of white that blocked out the sky. She pushed through it, punched a hole to the surface, and pulled herself up into a world transformed. The sun was shining. The sky was blue. The temperature was still below 0, but after 3 days of 40 below, it felt almost warm. She stood on top of the snowdrift and looked out at the valley. Smoke was rising from a few chimneys, the cabins that had made it through. But there were other cabins, other dugouts where no smoke rose, where no movement showed. Martha Vale's place was 2 miles south. Rana could see the roof from where she stood. No smoke. She found them huddled in the back of their cabin, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Martha's husband had made it back from Yankton the day before the storm hit, bringing fuel and supplies. But the fuel had been damp, stored improperly during the thaw, and it wouldn't burn. They had tried for 2 days to get a fire going, tried everything they knew, and failed. Sophie, the little girl Ragna had saved with steam and stones, was unconscious. Her skin was blue at the edges. Her breathing was shallow and slow. "She won't wake up," Martha said. Her voice was numb with exhaustion and fear. "I've tried everything. I've tried." She stopped. She didn't have words anymore. Ragna had brought quicklime, 5 pounds of it, almost all she had left. She did a slake in Martha's iron pot. She didn't trust their vessels, and the heat rose fast and strong. She warmed water. She warmed stones. She created a pocket of heat around Sophie's small body and held it there for an hour, 2 hours, 3. Slowly, the color came back. Slowly, the breathing deepened. Slowly, the little girl's eyes opened. "Mama?" Sophie whispered. Martha broke. She grabbed her daughter and held her and sobbed, and Ragna stood back and watched and thought about what this had cost her. 5 pounds of quicklime. Almost nothing left, but 2 more people alive who would have been dead. She thought about Elias's words from months ago. A survivor guards a trick. A craftsman teaches a method. She had come here to survive, but somewhere along the way, she wasn't sure when, she had become something more. Word spread. Martha told everyone who would listen, just as she had promised. The woman who had saved her daughter. The stone that gave off heat. The dugout that had outlasted the storm without a real fire burning. People came, first curious, then desperate, then determined. Families who had barely survived. Settlers who had lost livestock, lost supplies, lost hope. They wanted to know how. They wanted to learn. Ragna looked at her shelf, at the 30 pounds of quicklime that was supposed to last her until spring. Then she looked at the faces in her doorway, at the children hiding behind their mothers, at the men who had mocked her and doubted her and told everyone she was insane. "Come in," she said. "I'll show you what I know." The aftermath of the January storm took 3 weeks to count. 11 people dead across the county, 4 of them children, livestock losses in the hundreds, 3 families left with nothing, their cabins collapsed under snow weight, their supplies buried, their futures erased. Ragna's dugout still stood, her children still breathed, and word of what she had done was spreading faster than the spring thaw. August Halverson came on the first day of February. He didn't ride this time. His mare had died in the storm, frozen in the barn when the temperature dropped too fast for him to reach her. He walked the 4 miles from his cabin to Ragna's claim, moving slow through snow that still reached his knees in the drifts. Ragna saw him coming from the bluff. She had climbed up to check the limestone face, to see how much stone remained for future burning. When she recognized his shape on the horizon, she climbed down and waited by the dugout door. He stopped 10 feet away. His face was thinner than she remembered. The storm had cost him too. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he held himself, in the new lines carved around his mouth. "Mrs. Moen," he said. "Mr. Halverson." He stood there for a long moment, looking at the dugout, at the door that still hung on its hinges, at the roof that still held its weight, at the window board that had a new gap stuffed with cloth, evidence of the battle that had raged inside. "I came to see for myself," he said finally. "I heard the stories, heard what you did, heard about the sheriff." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. So I walked 4 miles in the snow to see with my own eyes. And what do you see? I see a dugout that should be a grave." He took a step closer. "I see a woman who should be dead. I see children who should be frozen in their beds." Another step. "And I see none of those things. I see life where I predicted death." Ragna said nothing. She waited. Halverson reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He held it out to her. "This is $32, he said. "Everything I have left after the storm. I want you to teach me what you know. You want to learn about quicklime? I want to learn how to survive when everything I know says survival is impossible." His voice cracked slightly. "I buried a son because I thought I understood this land. I watched 11 people die this month because they thought they understood it too. You understood something we didn't, something we couldn't see." He pushed the pouch toward her. "Teach me, please." Ragna looked at the money, looked at the man who had told her the cold would take her children before Sunday, looked at the pride crumbling in his face, replaced by something rawer and more honest. "Keep your money," she said. "I don't teach for pay." "Then why do you teach?" "Because knowledge that stays in one head dies with that head." She stepped aside and gestured toward the dugout door. "Come inside. I'll show you what I showed Martha Vale, what I've been showing everyone who asks." Halvorsen hesitated. Then he put the money back in his coat and walked through the door. Inside, Elias was sitting by the trough, sorting the last of the quicklime into containers. He looked up when Halvorsen entered, and his face went hard. "You," Elias said. "You know each other?" Ragna asked.
We've met. Halverson's voice was careful. Years ago, before his accident. You were the foreman on the Yankton job, Elias said. The one who pushed the crew too hard.
The one who said we could finish before the freeze if we just worked faster. I was. The cornerstone that crushed my ankle. It fell because we were rushing, because you wanted the job done a week early. Halverson was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. I know, he said. I've known for 15 years. I've thought about it every winter since. He looked at Elias, really looked, taking in the clouded eyes and the twisted ankle and the shaking hands. I'm sorry. I was young and stupid, and I didn't understand what my decisions cost other people. Sorry doesn't fix my ankle. No, it doesn't. Halverson pulled out the leather pouch again. But this might help. $32 for the man whose life I ruined. Elias stared at the money. His jaw worked silently. I don't want your guilt money. Then don't take it as guilt money. Take it as payment. Halverson set the pouch on the bench beside Elias. Payment for teaching me what you taught her. Payment for the knowledge that kept her alive when everything I knew said she would die. Elias looked at Ragna. She could see the conflict in his face, the old anger fighting against something newer, something that looked almost like purpose. He wants to learn, Ragna said quietly. And you're the one who taught me? You should be the one who teaches him. Elias was silent for a long time. Then he picked up a piece of quicklime from the sorting pile and held it out to Halverson. This is calcium oxide, he said. It was limestone 2 months ago. Mrs. Moen burned it in a field kiln using driftwood and coal screenings and more stubbornness than I've seen in 60 years of living. He dropped the quicklime into Halverson's palm. Hold it. Feel the weight. That weight is what kept her children alive when your predictions said they would freeze. Halverson held the white stone. His hand trembled slightly. Now, Elias said, sit down and pay attention, because I'm only going to explain this once. The teaching sessions became a daily occurrence. Halverson came back the next day, and the day after that. He brought others with him, settlers who had heard the stories, families who had lost confidence in their own preparations, young couples who were planning to file claims in the spring and wanted to know how to survive their first winter. Ragna's dugout became a classroom. She taught them what Elias had taught her, the chemistry of quicklime, not in scientific terms, but in practical ones. How to identify good limestone, how to build a field kiln, how to judge when a burn was complete, how to store the product dry, how to slake safely. She taught them what she had learned herself, the rhythm of emergency heating, the discipline of small charges, the technique of warming stones and water instead of trying to warm the whole room, the importance of ventilation, of keeping children back, of never getting careless. And she taught them something else, something that wasn't about lime at all. The difference between surviving and dying, she said one afternoon when the dugout was crowded with a dozen listeners, isn't strength. It isn't luck. It isn't even preparation, though preparation helps. Then what is it? Someone asked. Seeing what's actually there instead of what you expect to see. Ragna picked up a piece of raw limestone from the basket by her feet. Everyone who looked at this bluff saw rock. Useless rock. I saw it too at first. But I also remembered something from 20 years ago, white stones hissing in the rain. And I asked myself, what if that memory means something? What if the thing I'm looking at isn't what everyone says it is? She set the limestone down. You can't prepare for every disaster. You can't stockpile enough wood, enough food, enough money to handle everything this land throws at you. But you can train yourself to see differently, to look at what you have and ask, what else could this be? What am I missing? What does everyone assume that might not be true? The listeners were quiet. Some of them nodded slowly. Others looked skeptical. "That sounds like philosophy," one man said. "I came here to learn about burning rocks." "It is philosophy," Ragna said. "And you'll learn about burning rocks too. But the rocks won't save you if you can't see them for what they are. The knowledge won't help if you're too proud to use it when the time comes." She looked around the room, at Halverson, who had predicted her death, and was now sitting at her feet like a student, at Martha Vale, who had called her a fool and was now helping demonstrate the slaking technique, at all the faces that had doubted her, dismissed her, written her off as a mad woman cooking cliffstone. "Pride almost killed Sheriff Kittredge," she said. "He walked into the worst storm in years because he was too proud to admit he was wrong about me. He almost froze to death 2 miles from shelter because he couldn't see past his own assumptions." She paused. "I saved his life with the same method he tried to call dangerous. I saved his life because I was willing to see him as a man who was dying, not as an enemy who deserved to die." "Some would say you should have let him freeze," someone muttered. "Some would be wrong." Ragnar's voice was sharp. "This isn't about revenge. This isn't about proving who was right and who was wrong. This is about survival, not just your own survival, but the survival of everyone around you. Because when the cold comes, it doesn't care who you hate or who hates you. It just kills. And the only way to beat it is to help each other, even when helping is hard." The room was very quiet. "Now," Ragnar said, "who wants to learn how to build a field kiln?" Martha Vale's conversion was complete by mid-February. She had been the practical skeptic, the voice of reasonable doubt, the woman who had said, "If you have wood enough to burn rocks, then cut wood instead." She had been right in a way. Her logic was sound, her objection made sense. But the storm had proven that sound logic and sensible objections weren't enough. Sound logic said to cut wood. Sensible objections said burning rocks was wasteful. And sound logic and sensible objections had nearly killed her daughter. Now Martha was one of Ragnar's best students. She came every day, sometimes twice. She took notes in a small ledger book her husband had given her. She practiced slaking until she could do it as smoothly as Ragnar herself. She learned to identify limestone grades, to judge kiln temperatures, to store quicklime properly, and she started teaching others. "You don't need to do everything yourself," she told Ragnar one afternoon. They were sitting outside the dugout, watching the February sun melt the last of the deep snow. "You're wearing yourself out trying to teach everyone who comes. Let me help. Let me take some of the load." "You're still learning yourself." "I know enough to teach the basics. The identification, the storage, the safety rules." Martha pulled out her ledger. "I've written it all down. Everything you've taught me. Everything Elias has explained. I could teach a class tomorrow if I needed to." Ragnar looked at the ledger, at the neat handwriting, the careful diagrams, the organized lists of steps and warnings and techniques. "You've done good work," she said. "I've had a good teacher." Martha closed the ledger. "Let me do this. Let me take the beginners. You focus on the advanced work, the kiln building, the troubleshooting, the things that only you and Elias really understand. We can reach more people that way." Ragnar thought about it. Thought about the exhaustion that had been building for weeks. The endless questions, the constant demonstrations, the never-ending stream of faces seeking knowledge. "All right," she said. "We'll try it." Martha smiled. It was the first real smile Ragnar had seen from her since the storm. "Thank you," Martha said, "for teaching me, for saving my Sophie, for—" She stopped, her voice catching. "For being right when I was wrong. You weren't wrong. Your logic was sound. My logic was sound for a normal winter. This wasn't a normal winter." Martha stood and brushed snow from her skirt.
I've spent my whole life trusting what I knew, trusting that if I worked hard and planned well and did everything right, I'd be safe. The storm taught me that's not enough. Sometimes you need to know things you never expected to need. Sometimes you need to see differently. She walked away toward her wagon where her husband was waiting. Ragna watched her go and felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been tight for months was loosening. She wasn't alone anymore. She had allies now, partners, people who believed what she believed and wanted to spread that belief further. The method wasn't just hers anymore. It was becoming something bigger. Kittredge's transformation was slower. He had stayed in the dugout for 3 days after the storm, too weak to travel. During that time, he had watched everything, the slaking, the teaching, the stream of neighbors seeking help. He had said almost nothing. When he finally left, he walked out without a word of thanks. Ragna didn't expect any, but in the weeks that followed, things changed. The notices stopped. The threats about removing her children disappeared. The pressure on merchants to deny her credit evaporated. And then, in late February, Jonas Creel's land agent arrived at her dugout with a document. "Mr. Creel has decided to withdraw his claim to your property," the agent said. He was a nervous man in a too-clean suit, clearly uncomfortable being there. "He says the matter is settled and he wishes you no further difficulty." "Why the change of heart?" The agent shifted his weight. "I couldn't say, ma'am. I just deliver the papers." Ragna took the document. Read it carefully. It was legitimate, a formal withdrawal of all claims and liens against her property. "Tell Mr. Creel I accept his withdrawal," she said. "And tell him that if he ever needs help surviving a cold snap, my door is open, even to him." The agent blinked. "You would help him after what he tried to do?" "I would help anyone who was dying. That's what survival means." She folded the document and tucked it into her coat. "Now get off my property. You're making my children nervous." The agent left in a hurry. Ragna stood in the doorway and watched his wagon disappear over the rise. She thought about Kittredge, lying on her floor with blue lips and frozen clothes. She thought about the moment she had decided to save him, not because he deserved it, but because letting him die would have made her something she didn't want to be. She hadn't expected anything in return, hadn't saved him for advantage or leverage or future benefit. But here she was, holding a document that gave her what she had been fighting for since August: security, safety, the right to stay on land that was legally hers. She thought about what Elias had said months ago: a survivor guards a trick, a craftsman teaches a method. Maybe there was a third thing, a third kind of person, someone who gave help freely and found that the giving created more than the guarding ever could. Elias got weaker through February. It happened slowly at first. He slept longer, ate less. His hands shook more when he tried to demonstrate techniques. His clouded eyes seemed to retreat further into his skull. Ragna pretended not to notice. Elias pretended it wasn't happening. They both knew the truth, but neither of them wanted to speak it. Then one night in early March, Elias didn't wake up for dinner. Ragna found him in his corner, still wrapped in blankets, his breathing shallow and uneven. His skin was gray in the lantern light. His lips were cracked and dry. "Elias," she knelt beside him. "Elias, can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly. They were more clouded than ever, but somewhere behind the cataracts, recognition flickered. "Ragna." His voice was barely a whisper. "I was dreaming about the warehouse job, the one in 57, biggest kiln I ever built." "Don't talk. Save your strength." "Strength?" He almost laughed. "I haven't had strength in 15 years, just stubbornness, and even that's running out." "You'll be fine. You just need rest." I need a lot of things that rest won't give me. His hand found hers, cold and thin and trembling. Listen to me. There are things I haven't taught you yet. Things about scaling up, about teaching others to teach, about building kilns that can serve a whole community instead of just one family. You can teach me tomorrow. There won't be a tomorrow, not for me. His grip tightened. So listen now. Write it down if you have to, but remember this. He talked for an hour, maybe more. His voice came and went, sometimes clear, sometimes fading into mumbles that Ragna had to lean close to hear. He talked about kiln design and fuel efficiency and storage systems and teaching techniques and all the knowledge he had accumulated in 30 years of professional work. And he talked about other things too. I never had children, he said at one point. Never married, never wanted to. The work was everything. The craft was everything. His eyes found hers through the haze. I thought I was saving my knowledge for something important, some big project, some legacy that would last. This is a legacy, Ragna said. What you've taught me, what I'm teaching others, that's a legacy. It's better than a legacy, it's alive. He coughed weakly. Legacies sit in buildings and books. This is in people, in hands, in the way a woman looks at a pile of rock and sees heat instead of stone. He squeezed her hand. You're my legacy, Ragna. You and everyone you teach. That's better than any building I could have built. His eyes closed. His breathing slowed. Ragna sat with him through the night. She held his hand and listened to each breath, counting them like coins, knowing she was watching something precious slip away. At dawn, the breathing stopped. She sat for a long time in the gray light, holding a hand that had grown cold. She thought about the man who had walked into her life 6 months ago, half blind, half lame, living in a lean-to behind a warehouse. She thought about everything he had given her. Not just the knowledge, though the knowledge had saved her life and the lives of her children, but the belief, the confidence, the sense that she was capable of something no one else could see. He had believed in her before she believed in herself. He had taught her not just how to burn lime, but how to see possibility where others saw only rock. And now he was gone. Ragna pulled the blanket over his face. She stood slowly, her joints stiff from the long night. She walked to the door of the dugout and looked out at the March morning. The snow was melting. The sun was rising. Spring was coming to Dakota territory, whether she was ready for it or not. She had work to do, teaching to continue, a method to spread, a legacy to protect. She would mourn Elias. She would honor his memory. But she would not stop. That was what he would have wanted. That was what he had taught her. A craftsman teaches a method. She would be that craftsman now. The weeks after Elias's death were the hardest of Ragna's life, harder than the storm, harder than the desperate months of preparation, harder than anything she had faced since arriving in Dakota territory. Not because of the work was familiar now, almost routine. The teaching sessions continued. The students came and learned and left. Martha handled the beginners. Halverson helped with the advanced classes. The method spread from family to family, claim to claim, settlement to settlement. The hard part was the silence. Elias had been there every day for months. His voice, his advice, his dry humor and sharp corrections. She hadn't realized how much she had come to depend on his presence until it was gone. Now, when a student asked a difficult question, she couldn't look to the corner for help. When a kiln burn went wrong, she couldn't hear his voice telling her what she had missed. When the weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, she couldn't share it with someone who understood. She was alone in a way she hadn't been alone since the beginning. But she was also stronger than she had been at the beginning. She knew things now that she hadn't known then. She had done things that she hadn't believed possible, and she had his voice in her memory, guiding her even when he wasn't there to speak. The first rule of Quicklime is respect. Trust yourself. A craftsman teaches a method. She carried his words like stones in her pocket. She pulled them out when she needed them. She passed them on to her students, who passed them on to their students, who would pass them on to theirs. That was the legacy, not buildings, not documents, not monuments. Words passed from hand to hand like flame. The spring fever came in late March. It started at the Hansen claim, 4 miles north. A young mother and her 3 children alone while her husband was working the spring cattle drive. She hadn't wanted to bother anyone, said she would be fine, said it was just a cold, said she didn't need help. By the time word reached Ragna, 2 of the children were unconscious, and the mother could barely stand. Ragna packed her supplies and walked the 4 miles in mud that sucked at her boots and wind that cut through her coat. She arrived to find a cabin that was barely warmer than the outside air, a fire that had gone out 2 days ago, and a family that was dying by inches. She didn't have Quicklime with her. She had used the last of her winter supply and hadn't burned more yet. But she had knowledge, and knowledge was sometimes enough. She got the fire going again, using techniques Elias had taught her about coaxing flame from damp wood. She boiled water and made steam, the same way she had done with Nels and Sophie, and held the unconscious children in the vapor until their breathing eased. She forced broth into the mother's mouth and warmed stones for their beds, and stayed for 2 days, nursing them through the worst of it. When the fever broke, Mrs. Hansen looked at her with eyes that were clear for the first time in a week. "How did you know what to do?" she whispered. "Someone taught me," Ragna said. "Now I'm going to teach you." She stayed another day, showing Mrs. Hansen everything she could about fever care and emergency heating and the basics of quicklime preparation. She left with a promise that she would return when the burning season came to help build a kiln and prepare a proper supply. Walking back to her own claim, Ragna thought about what had just happened. She had saved a family, not with quicklime, but with the same principles that made quicklime work: preparation, observation, the willingness to see what was actually there instead of what you expected to see. Elias had taught her about burning rocks, but he had also taught her something bigger, something that didn't require rocks at all. He had taught her how to think like a survivor. The spring brought more students than Ragna could handle alone. Word had spread beyond the immediate settlements. People were coming from Yankton, from Vermilion, from places she had never heard of. They wanted to learn the method. They wanted to see the woman who had survived the January storm with nothing but rock and water. Martha took on more responsibility. She ran classes 3 days a week now, teaching the basics to anyone who showed up. Halvor, centralization, a community kiln that serves multiple families. One big burn in the fall, shared among everyone who contributes fuel and labor. Proper storage in a dry building instead of individual dugouts and cabins. That would take organization, planning. It would take cooperation. Ragna looked around the room. The same kind of cooperation we needed to survive the storm. The same kind that's kept this settlement alive when others have failed. The idea took root. By May, the first community kiln project was underway, a proper stone structure on the edge of the settlement, funded by contributions from 24 families. Ragna designed it using principles Elias had described in his final hours. Halverson supervised the construction. Martha organized the fuel collection. It wouldn't be ready until fall. But when winter came again, the settlement would be better prepared than any frontier community Ragna had ever heard of. Kittredge's final transformation came in June. Ragna was at the community kiln site, reviewing the construction progress, when she saw a wagon approaching. She recognized the horse before she recognized the driver. Kittredge pulled up and sat for a moment, looking at the half-built structure. His face was thinner than it had been in January. His eyes were different. The hardness was still there, but something else had crept in. Something that looked almost like shame. "Mrs. Moen," he said. "Sheriff?" "I'm not sheriff anymore. Resigned in April." He climbed down from the wagon. "Jonas Creel didn't take it well, said I was abandoning my obligations." "What obligations would those be?" "The ones that involved making your life difficult." Kittredge walked to the kiln foundation and ran his hand along the stone. "I've been watching what you've built here, what you've taught people, what's changed because of you." "I didn't build it alone." "No, but it started with you. The idea, the stubbornness, the willingness to keep going when everyone said you should stop." He turned to face her. "I've been thinking about that January night, about lying on your floor, watching you save my life with the same method I called dangerous. And what have you concluded? That I was wrong about everything that mattered." His voice was quiet but steady. "I told myself I was protecting the community, protecting children from a dangerous woman with dangerous ideas. But I wasn't protecting anyone. I was protecting my own pride, my own certainty that I knew better than some Norwegian widow with a wet dugout and 2 hungry children." He reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper. "This is the deed to my cabin," he said. 8 acres of good land, timber rights included. I'm giving it to the settlement for the community kiln project, for whatever you need it for." Ragna stared at the paper. "You're giving away your home?" "I'm making amends, or trying to." He held out the deed. "I can't undo what I did, can't give you back the months of fear and struggle, can't erase the lies I told or the pressure I applied, but I can give you this. And I can tell you," his voice cracked slightly, "I can tell you that I was wrong, completely, totally wrong, and I'm sorry." Ragna took the deed. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Kittredge, at the man who had been her enemy, her persecutor, her closest brush with defeat. "I forgave you in January," she said, "when I opened my door and pulled you inside instead of letting you freeze. That was the moment I decided that what you had done didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what you could become. And what can I become? Someone who helps instead of hinders. Someone who builds instead of destroys." She tucked the deed into her coat. "The community kiln project needs workers, strong backs, willing hands. If you want to make amends, start there." Kittredge nodded slowly. "I can do that." "Then do it. And when you're done, maybe you'll understand something that took me months to learn." "What's that?" "That survival isn't about winning or losing. It isn't about proving who was right. It's about making sure everyone gets through, even the people who tried to stop you." She turned and walked back to the kiln site. Behind her, she heard Kittredge's footsteps following. He showed up the next day with a hammer and a load of timber, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of the month. By July, he was one of the project's most dedicated workers. A new figure appeared in Ragna's life that summer. His name was Peter Wahl, Martha's widowed brother, a cooper and tinsmith from Wisconsin who had come west to start fresh after losing his wife to cholera. He was 40 years old, quiet, methodical, with hands that knew how to shape metal and wood into useful things. He came to a teaching session in early June, sat in the back, and said nothing. He came again the next day, and the next. On the 4th day, he stayed after the others had left. "I have some questions," he said, "about the vessels you use for slaking." "What kind of questions?" "Design questions. The iron trough you use. It works, but it's crude. The heat distribution is uneven. The steam escapes in all directions. The reaction is hard to control. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. I've been thinking about improvements, a double-walled design with a controlled vent, better heat retention, safer operation. Ragna looked at the sketches. They were precise, professional, the work of someone who understood how materials behaved under stress. "These are good," she said.
"They're ideas. I'd need to build a prototype to know if they work." He folded the paper. "I was hoping you'd let me try. Let me build something better and test it here, where you can tell me what's wrong with it." "Why me?" "Because you understand how the method works, what it needs, what its limits are." His eyes met hers. "And because my sister won't stop talking about you. She says you see things other people miss. I want to work with someone who sees clearly." It was the beginning of a partnership, though neither of them called it that at first. Peter built his prototype. It worked better than Ragnar's original trough. He built a second version, then a third. Each iteration was an improvement. Safer, more efficient, more controlled. They spent long hours together discussing designs and testing modifications and arguing about approaches. He was stubborn, she discovered, almost as stubborn as she was. But his stubbornness was different from hers, quieter, more methodical, grounded in the patience of a man who had spent his life working with materials that demanded precision. "You don't give up," she said one evening, after they had spent 3 hours trying to solve a venting problem. "Neither do you." He looked at her across the workbench. "That's why we work well together." She felt something shift when he said that, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe not since her husband had disappeared down the freight road, leaving her with 2 children and a pile of broken promises. She wasn't ready for it, wasn't sure she wanted it, but she felt it anyway. The summer of 1888 was the busiest of Ragnar's life. The community kiln project consumed most of her waking hours. There were designs to finalize, materials to source, labor to coordinate, disagreements to settle. A dozen families had contributed to the effort, and a dozen families had a dozen opinions about how things should be done. Ragnar learned to navigate the conflicts. She learned when to push and when to compromise. She learned that building a community was harder than building a kiln, and that both required the same fundamental skill, the ability to take raw materials and shape them into something stronger than they had been alone. By August, the kiln was complete. It stood at the edge of the settlement, a stone structure 12 feet high with thick walls and a proper chimney. It could process 500 pounds of limestone in a single burn, enough to supply every participating family with a winter's worth of emergency heat. The dedication ceremony drew people from miles around. Settlers who had never met Ragnar came to see the structure they had heard about, the method they had heard whispered, the woman who had survived the January storm with nothing but rock and determination. Ragnar stood before the crowd and felt the weight of their attention. A year ago, she had been a widow in a wet dugout, mocked by her neighbors, dismissed by everyone who thought they knew better. Now she was something else, something she hadn't expected to become. "This kiln," she said, her voice carrying across the gathered faces, "doesn't belong to me. It belongs to all of you, to everyone who contributed fuel and labor and belief, to everyone who looked at an impossible idea and said, 'maybe,' instead of 'no.'" She paused, looked at the faces she knew, Martha, Halverson, Kittredge, standing quietly at the back, looked at the faces she didn't know, the settlers from distant claims, the families who had traveled hours to be here. "A man named Elias Torgrim taught me everything I know about burning lime. He's gone now, but his knowledge lives on in this kiln, in the people I've taught, in the students who will teach others after I'm gone." She touched the warm stone of the kiln wall. "He told me once that a survivor guards a trick, but a craftsman teaches a method. I've tried to be a craftsman. I hope I've succeeded." The crowd was silent. Then someone started clapping. Others joined. Within moments, the applause was rolling across the gathering like thunder. Ragna stood in the center of it and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride. Real pride, untainted by desperation or fear. She had built something that would outlast her, something that would keep people alive long after she was gone. That was enough. That was more than enough. The first community burn happened in September. 23 families contributed fuel. 19 contributed labor. The burn lasted 4 days, with teams working in shifts to keep the fire at the right temperature, to feed it properly, to ensure the limestone converted completely. Ragna supervised, but she didn't do the work alone. Martha managed the fuel rotation. Halverson handled the temperature monitoring. Pater designed and built a new loading system that made the process faster and safer. And Kittredge, the former sheriff, the former enemy, hauled stone from the bluff to the kiln site, hour after hour, day after day. He didn't complain, didn't ask for recognition, just worked, quietly and steadily, as if each stone he carried was a debt being paid. By the end of the burn, they had produced 800 pounds of quicklime. Ragna helped divide it among the participating families. Each household received a share proportional to their contribution, stored in vessels that Pater had built, double-walled iron containers with tight-fitting lids and proper ventilation channels. "This is enough for most emergencies," she told each family as they collected their share. "But remember, emergencies don't follow schedules. If you run out, come to the community store. If you have extra, contribute it back. We survive together, or we don't survive at all." The families listened. Most of them had lost someone in January or knew someone who had. They understood now what they hadn't understood before. The preparation meant nothing if it wasn't shared, that knowledge hoarded was knowledge wasted. The settlement had changed. Ragna could see it in the way people talked to each other, helped each other, planned together for challenges that might never come. The storm had broken something, but it had also built something. A community that knew its own fragility, a people who had learned to see clearly. Pater proposed in October. He didn't do it with flowers or poetry or any of the romantic gestures Ragna's husband had used 20 years ago. He did it with a question asked quietly one evening while they were cleaning up after a design session. "I was wondering," he said, "if you had considered remarrying." Ragna set down the tool she was holding. "That's an unusual way to open a conversation." "I'm an unusual man." He didn't look at her. His hands kept moving, organizing materials, straightening the workbench. "I've been thinking about it for months, about what it would mean, what it would change." "And what have you concluded?" "That I don't want to change anything." Now he looked at her. His eyes were steady, calm, the way they always were when he was working through a difficult problem. "I don't want to take over your life or your work or your family. I don't want to be the head of anything. I just want to be beside you, working with you, building things together." Ragna thought about her first husband, about the promises he had made and broken, about the way he had smiled when he left for Kansas and never looked back. This was different. Pater wasn't promising her the moon. He wasn't offering to solve her problems or carry her burdens. He was offering something simpler, partnership, the kind of partnership they had already built, formalized, and made permanent. "I have children," she said. "They come first, always." "I know. I wouldn't want it any other way. I have work, teaching, building, improving. That won't stop because I have a husband." "I know that too. I want to help with the work, not replace it." Ragna was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Elias, about what he had said before he died, about legacies and life and the things that mattered most. "Yes," she said.
Petter blinked. Yes. Yes, I've considered remarrying. And yes, I think I'd like to, if you're the one asking. His face changed. The calm competence gave way to something younger, something almost boyish. He smiled, a real smile, the first one she had ever seen from him. I'm the one asking, he said. They were married in November in a small ceremony at the community hall. Martha stood as witness. Halverson gave a toast that managed to be both gruff and heartfelt. Even Kittredge came, standing in the back, saying nothing, but present. Liv and Nels stood beside Ragna throughout the ceremony. They had known Peter for months, had watched him work alongside their mother, had seen the way he treated her, with respect, with patience, with the kind of steady attention that children notice even when adults don't. When the ceremony was over, Nels tugged at Peter's sleeve. Are you our father now? He asked. Peter knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. I'm whatever you need me to be, he said. Father, friend, teacher, you decide. Nels thought about it for a moment. Then he nodded seriously. Father, then, he said. But you have to help me build things. Deal. They shook hands, man and boy, and Ragna felt her heart do something it hadn't done in years. It opened. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was milder than the year before. There were cold snaps. There were always cold snaps in Dakota Territory, but nothing like the January storm that had killed 11 people and changed everything. The community kiln supplies were barely touched. The emergency slakes were few and far between. Some people said the mild winter proved that Ragna's method was unnecessary, that the January storm had been a fluke, a once-in-a-generation catastrophe that wouldn't repeat. Ragna knew better. The weather doesn't follow patterns, she told a gathering of new students that spring. It doesn't care what happened last year or what you expect this year. It just is. And the day you decide you're safe because nothing bad happened recently, that's the day you're most vulnerable. She continued teaching, continued improving, continued expanding the network of people who understood the method and could pass it on. By the end of 1889, there were community kilns in 3 settlements. By 1890, there were 5. By 1891, the technique had spread to neighboring counties, carried by settlers who had learned it from settlers who had learned it from Ragna. She didn't try to control the spread, didn't try to claim credit or ownership or authority. The knowledge was bigger than her now, bigger than any one person. It had taken on a life of its own. That was what Elias had wanted. That was what he had meant when he talked about craftsmen and methods and legacies that outlived the people who created them. She thought about him often, talked to him sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn when the rest of the household was sleeping. She told him about the kilns, the students, the families that had survived because of what he taught her. She hoped he could hear her. She hoped he was proud. The years compressed themselves the way years do when they are full. Peter expanded his workshop. He developed new vessel designs, new storage systems, new tools for the burning and slaking process. His work became known across the territory. The Vale vessels, people called them, though Peter always insisted they should be called the Moenval vessels. Ragna taught. Year after year, season after season, she stood before groups of settlers and explained what she had learned, the science of it when people wanted science, the practice of it when people wanted practice, the philosophy of it when people were ready to hear. The method isn't magic, she would say. It's observation, preparation, the willingness to see what's actually there instead of what you expect to see. Anyone can learn it. Anyone can use it. The only thing it requires is the humility to admit that you don't know everything and the courage to try something new. Liv grew up. She became a school teacher in Yankton,
Educated beyond what most women of her generation could hope for. She married a lawyer, had 3 children, and taught all of them about quicklime before they were 10 years old. Nels grew up. He learned tinsmithing from Pater, construction from Halverson, and something harder to name from Ragna, the ability to look at a problem and see solutions that others couldn't imagine. He took over the community kiln project when Ragna grew too old to manage it and expanded it into a proper cooperative that served settlements across 3 counties. Martha Vale died in 1894, peacefully in her sleep. Her daughter Sophie, the little girl Ragna had saved twice, spoke at the funeral about what her mother had learned in the last years of her life, about seeing clearly, about helping freely, about the kind of knowledge that passed from hand to hand like flame. Halverson died in 1896, still gruff, still certain, but softer than he had been in January of '88. His last words, according to his granddaughter, were about Ragna. "She proved me wrong," he said. "Best thing that ever happened to me." Kittredge outlived them both. He never fully rejoined society, never reclaimed his position or his reputation, but he worked, quietly, steadily, without complaint. He hauled stone for the community kilns until his back gave out. Then he sorted materials. Then he trained others to do the work he could no longer do himself. When he died in 1903, Ragna spoke at his funeral. She told the story of January 12th, 1888. Of a man who had wanted her dead, who had nearly frozen on her doorstep, who had been saved by the very method he had tried to destroy. "Amos Kittredge was my enemy," she said. "Then he was my student. Then he was my colleague. And in the end, he was something like a friend." She paused. "People change. That's the whole point. That's what survival means, not staying the same, but becoming something better. Amos became something better. We all can." Ragna lived to see the new century. She was 62 years old when 1900 arrived, still teaching, still improving, still thinking about problems that others had stopped trying to solve. Her hair had gone white. Her hand shook sometimes, the way Elias's had shaken in his final years. But her mind was clear, and her eyes still saw things that others missed. The world had changed around her. Railroads crossed the territory now. Towns had grown into cities. The frontier was closing, the newspapers said, the wild land being tamed and settled and organized. But winter still came. Cold still killed. And the knowledge that Ragna had preserved and spread still mattered, still saved lives, still made the difference between survival and death for families who lived beyond the reach of the new century's comforts. She taught her last class in the spring of 1904. 23 students, ranging from teenagers to grandparents, all gathered in the community hall that had been built on the site of her original dugout. The dugout itself was long gone, filled in and built over, but Ragna could still point to the spot where she had first understood what limestone could become. "I was 29 years old," she told the class, "when I arrived at this place with 2 children and $17 and a piece of knowledge that I didn't even know was knowledge. I thought I was going to die. Everyone thought I was going to die. A man I respected told me the cold would take my children before Sunday." She paused, looked at the faces watching her. "That man is dead now. I'm still here. Not because I was stronger or luckier or better than him, because I was willing to see differently. Because I asked a question that no one else was asking. What if the rock in this bluff could become something more?" She picked up a piece of quicklime from the demonstration table, held it up to the light. "This is just stone. Burned stone, changed stone, but still stone. It doesn't think. It doesn't hope. It doesn't care whether you live or die. But it can be used. It can be understood. It can be made into something that keeps families alive when everything else fails." She set the stone down. That's what I've tried to teach you. Not just the method. The method is simple. Anyone can learn it. But the way of seeing, the willingness to look at what you have and ask what else it could be, the courage to try something that everyone says is impossible. She looked around the room one more time, at the students who would become teachers, at the teachers who would become leaders, at the whole chain of knowledge stretching forward into a future she would never see. I won't be teaching much longer, she said. My hands don't work like they used to, and my eyes are starting to cloud. But the method will continue. You will continue. And when the next impossible winter comes, and it will come, because this land doesn't forget how to kill, you'll be ready, because you learn to see. The class applauded. Ragna smiled, bowed slightly, and walked out into the spring sunshine. She had done what she set out to do. She had built something that would outlast her. That was enough. Peter died in 1906, quietly, holding Ragna's hand. They had been married for 18 years. In that time, they had built a life together, not a dramatic life, not a legendary life, but a good one. A life of work and partnership and the small daily kindnesses that mattered more than grand gestures. Ragna mourned him the way she had mourned Elias, deeply, privately, without display. She talked to him in the dark hours, told him about her day, asked for his advice on problems she was trying to solve. She knew he couldn't answer, but the talking helped. She lived another 5 years after that. 5 years of slower teaching, smaller projects, more time spent sitting in the sun and watching the world go by. Her children visited often. Her grandchildren knew her as the woman who had survived the great storm, the woman who had taught half the territory how to burn lime, the woman who saw things that others couldn't see. She died in the spring of 1911 at the age of 73. Her last words, according to Liv, were about the dugout, about the January night when she had opened the door and let Kittredge in, about the choice she had made to save an enemy and how that choice had shaped everything that came after. It would have been easy to let him die, she whispered. Easy and justified and wrong. I chose harder. I chose better. She smiled. Make sure they remember that, not the lime, the choice. She closed her eyes. A moment later, she was gone. They buried her on the bluff above the Missouri River, in the spot where she had first seen the pale stone that would change her life. The funeral drew hundreds of people, settlers she had taught, families she had saved, strangers who had heard the stories and wanted to pay their respects. Nels spoke, then Liv, then Martha's daughter Sophie, now a woman in her 30s with children of her own, then others, one after another, each with a story about what Ragna had meant to them. The stories were different, but they all had something in common. They were all about seeing, about the moment when someone looked at an impossible situation and found a way through because Ragna had taught them how to look. The gravestone was simple. Her name, her dates, and a single line that Peter had suggested years before. She saw what others missed. By the winter following her death, 17 community kilns operated across the Dakota territories. Each one traced its lineage back to Ragna's original design, to the principles she had learned from Elias, to the method that had started in a wet dugout with a desperate woman and a handful of white stone. The settlers who used those kilns knew her name. They passed it down to their children, who passed it to their children, who passed it to theirs. She became part of the territory's story, not a legend exactly, but something more durable, a name attached to knowledge, a face connected to survival. When the harsh winters came, and they still came as hard and deadly as they had ever been, people reached for the sealed tins on their high shelves. They measured quicklime into iron vessels. They added water and felt the heat rise. And they remembered. 43 people across 3 counties learned the quicklime method directly from Ragna Moen in her lifetime. Each of them taught others, family members, neighbors,
strangers passing through who stayed long enough to listen. By the time Ragna died, the network of knowledge had spread beyond counting, carried on voices and hands, and the simple human instinct to share what works. One detail marked the settlements where the method had taken hold: white dusted tin stacked on high shelves in every kitchen and storeroom, sealed against moisture, waiting for the emergency that might never come. Those tins became a signature, a symbol, proof that the people who lived there had learned to see differently. Ragna Moen lived her final years in the house that Pater built on the site of her original claim. The dugout was long gone, filled in and forgotten, but she could still stand at her window and see the bluff where she had first broken limestone from the earth. She died in spring, with her children beside her and sunlight on her face. They buried her above the river, where the pale stone still shows through the dirt in places, and where the wind off the Missouri Trench still cuts cold enough to kill. On January 12, 1888, the temperature across Dakota Territory dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. The warm morning gave way to a killing afternoon. Snow fell sideways. The wind screamed across the plains with nothing to stop it. August Halverson, who had survived 17 Dakota winters and buried a son to the stock storm of 1880, looked at Ragna's dugout and delivered his verdict. "Keep those babies in that wet hole through January, and the cold will take them before Sunday." He was wrong. That night, while the storm raged and the cold pressed in from every direction, a woman who had never burned lime in her life kept her children alive with nothing but stone and water, and the knowledge that survival requires seeing what others miss. No fire burned in her chimney. No smoke rose from her roof, but heat rose from a trough of quicklime, steam lifted from boiling water, and 2 children slept with warm stones at their feet while the worst weather in memory tried to kill them. When the storm ended, Ragna Moen was still standing. Her children were still breathing, and on the shelf behind her, white stones waited in sealed tins, fire stored in rock, ready to burn again. The cold had come for her family. It found heat waiting there already.